know I've said this before, but it's so important I have to say it again. And it is the thesis of this whole video series. Our culture tells us lies or half-truths through its secular liturgies. And the church is the place that counters these falsehoods with the truth. And they need to be countered not just with words now and again, but with liturgies, with rituals, with habits. It's the only way to push back against them, because all week they're reinforced in us through rituals, routines, and habits. After the sermon in which God has spoken, we have an opportunity to respond. So that's why this section of the liturgy has been called the response to the word. Our first response is with a song. How we respond? What song we sing? Well, that depends on what God just finished saying to us. And then after the song, when I was a kid, we read one of the creeds. We would occasionally read out of the Nicene Creed, which was formulated in the 4th century. That one was cool because it talked about God being the creator of all things visible and invisible. I like that part about invisible. But most of the time we recited the Apostles' Creed. That comes from the very beginning of the church. The creeds are summaries of the basic beliefs of the Christian faith. If you believe what the creed says, you are a Christian. And if you don't, you aren't. So one of the reasons to recite one of the creeds every week is that it is important for the people who call themselves Christians to know what one is. That makes sense, doesn't it? But there's a second reason. Saying the Apostles' Creed binds everyone together with everyone who recites it. You literally hear other people declaring belief in exactly the same thing as you are declaring your belief in. This is part of the power of ritual. It's a literal connection with everyone in the room. But if you think about it just a little more, it also binds us to every Christian in the world and throughout history, since the very beginning of the church. We all believe the same thing. The regular practice of reciting the creed shapes me into a person that understands that the faith is not just about my own personal beliefs, nor about those of my local congregation, but those of every Christian everywhere and everywhen. It seems to me that this is something that we need reinforced in our individualistic culture. Then comes the prayer that is known by various names. The congregational prayer, the pastoral prayer, the prayer of intercession. When I was a kid, I thought of it just as the long prayer. This prayer was the killer. It was interminable. Not just because there were a whole lot of people in our particular church that needed prayer for certain things, but also because the preacher prayed about everything else too. Our city, the country. That prayer's scope was global. Wars and famines and earthquakes were extensively brought before the throne of heaven. It was long and difficult to endure, but even as a child I learned a few things from having to endure it all those years. Here's 7 things that I learned from the congregational prayer. We can talk to God. This might seem really rudimentary, but when you think about it, it really is a big deal, considering who we are talking to. And he will listen. The second thing I learned is that God is big. My dad was the preacher most of the time, so he did the long prayer, and he was a very good prayer. He had a lot of practice. He prayed conversationally, but not like he would talk to a regular person. He didn't use these and thous, but when he talked to God, he said things a little differently. He talked to God like he was big. Later, I would learn words like omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, but I didn't need the words to understand these things about God. It was because I experienced them every week in that prayer. My father's prayers always started, and they still do, for praising God of who he is. In short, for praising him because he's big. God is my Father. My father always addressed God as Father. He talked to God with familiarity and intimacy, as well as reverence and awe. So I learned that God was also good, a heavenly Father. The fourth thing I learned is that God is active. My dad prayed like God could really do something about the man who had cancer, or the missionaries in Africa, or the victims of flooding in China. He wasn't just a God who sat there and listened. He did stuff. He could do something about these things that we were praying about. So in this prayer, there was always that sense of expectation. God cares. He cares about the person that's in the hospital, and he cares about the family who's lost someone. He cares about the people in the world who don't have clean water or food. He cares about the missionaries who are bringing good news. And it's funny that I also got the impression from that prayer that he cares about me. I learned from the congregational prayer that he wasn't the God of just the people in my church. And he wasn't just the God of Christians. He was the God of everybody and everything. We prayed for our town and the leaders of our country and the leaders of other countries. We prayed that they would be wise and obedient. And at some point I figured out that this prayer wasn't just the preacher's prayer. It was the prayer of all God's people. Our prayer. There are more things that I learned from the prayer of intercession, but the important thing is that I learned them because these things were reinforced every week. They have stuck with me for many decades now, in part because of that repetition. My current church always prays for another local church and a missionary. I love this ritual too. It reminds us that our particular church is not the only one through which God is doing His work in our community and in the world. We are not in competition with other churches. We are all serving a God who has purposes in this world, mainly to see the flourishing of our communities and the spreading of the good news. One of the lies our culture tells us is that what we have is ours. It's our house, our car, our children, our time, our money. All week long we are told this lie over and over again, to the point that we can't help but believe it. These ideas out there shape us profoundly. So in church on Sunday, we need some countershaping by the truth, by reality. And one of the places this can happen is in the offering. First, there's an offertory prayer. The offertory prayer is a regular reminder that God has blessed us richly. All that we have comes from Him. He gives us the gifts through which we are to love our neighbor. This idea that we are created to be the conduits through which God blesses the world, well, we need regular reminders of that, especially North Americans. And then after that reminder, we engage in a physical action that ritually practices this truth. We put our money into a box or a collection plate or whatever. What we do with our bodies affects our souls. That's the power of liturgy. Giving is both a sacred duty and a joy. These terms seem contradictory, but they aren't when you fully understand that God has given you everything. If you understand that everything belongs to God, it's very easy to give Him His own stuff. When you think what's yours is yours, it's practically impossible to be a cheerful giver. And this is why I think we need to give people the opportunity to physically give every week, to put some money into something, to give it away and walk away. Just like when we were kids. Our parents always gave us a nickel to drop in the collection plate. We'd give away something that wasn't ours. It's no different now, giving away hundreds or thousands. You're giving away something that isn't yours. There are now ways for us to set up direct deposit and do e-transfers. This is so convenient. I wonder if we couldn't, though, keep on giving actual physical money as well, on a weekly basis. Just a few bucks or even a quarter. The ritual is what is important. We would be shaped by the act of giving. Something to think about. There's one more video in this series, and it involves the benediction and other things. So thank you, and we'll see you there.